preparing to request 10 years' worth of the president's tax returns. That's according to the Washington Post, which reports that the request could be made in the coming weeks. Sources tell CBS News lawmakers are working to build a legal and legislative case to obtain the president's taxes. And a spokeswoman for House Speaker Nancy Pelosi said Democrats will take the issue to court if necessary. My colleague Rena Ninan discussed this with George Yim. He is a professor of law and taxation at the University of Virginia School of Law and former chief of staff for the Joint Committee on Taxation. He has also testified before Congress numerous times, including earlier this year when he spoke about legislation that would require the release of the president and vice president's tax returns. Here's their conversation.
Could you just walk us through, George, the process that might play out if Congress was to try and obtain the president's tax returns?
Sure. The law is really very straightforward. It authorizes the chairman of one of the tax committees to make a request in writing from the Secretary of the Treasury for any tax return information of any person, including the president's, and then it directs the Secretary of the Treasury to provide the information that was requested.
As I mentioned earlier, you testified before Congress earlier this year about legislation which would require the president and the vice president to release their returns. What would that legislation look like?
Well, there is proposed legislation that would require presidents and vice presidents in the future to disclose. Right now, the practice, it's an informal practice that's been going on for 40 years, and the current president has broken that practice. But there's nothing in the law that would require the current president to provide the information. And so the proposal would then create a new law that would require that in the future.
You say it would require creating a new law, but is there any precedent for the Treasury Secretary to actually refuse a request from lawmakers to turn over the president's tax information?
Well, the law doesn't provide any basis for a refusal. And so here we're now talking about the existing law, not the proposal that is before Congress. Existing law authorizes the tax committee chair to make the request, and the law does not provide any basis for a refusal.
The president's made it very clear he does not want to release his tax returns. He's in the past cited that he's been audited. What would this look like if the president was forced to issue his tax returns? Are you talking about a court battle here?
Perhaps. So again, the law doesn't provide any basis for a refusal, but that doesn't mean that there might not still be a refusal, in which case then it would be up to Congress, of course, to determine what it wanted to do. If it wanted to try to enforce the request, presumably it would end up in court.
So what steps could lawmakers take in addition to taking this issue to court?
Well, I assumed that Congress would probably want to enforce their request. So they've obviously been considering this very seriously. And if they do go ahead and make the request, I'm assuming that if they were refused, they would try to enforce it. There's really no precedent that I'm aware of for a refusal in this case. And so so you're kind of on uncharted territory to figure out what would happen. There was an analogous situation where subpoenas have been made and the witness has refused, and that has ended up in court. And there are some court cases that have dealt with that situation.
You mentioned those subpoenas. We know there are Democrats who are eager to potentially issue a subpoena to get those tax returns. But are there any unintended consequences that Democrats might not be thinking about at this point?
Well, one of the issues that's been raised is whether if the tax committee were to proceed with this request of the president's information, that it might open up a can of worms and that future tax committees might misuse the same authority to seek out return information of other politicians or other prominent people in the country. And obviously, the authority could be misused, and it would be a very bad thing if it were misused. But I'm frankly not as fretful as some about that consequence, simply because a mere 5 years ago, it was already misused. And so, yes, there would be the possibility. I think the real question that the committee needs to face right now is, would their exercise of this authority be proper? And if it is proper in their view, I don't think that I would be too worried about the possibility of misuse in the future.
George Yen, thank you very much for your time.